I want particularly, Peter, to thank you for engaging in spirited debate and particularly coming, if you will, into a Christian setting. This has really been a challenge. Let me say a couple of things. There are, first of all, a few things that you didn't answer that I raised earlier. For example, this idea that we should be able to snuff out our children's lives up to the age of 28 days. I suspect you wanted to step aside from some of these controversial views and stay on relatively safe ground. I do want to answer your points about Jesus and about the Old Testament. First of all, on the issue of Jesus, the Bible clearly operates on multiple levels. It operates at the literal level. It also operates at the level of parable, the level of allegory, and so on. Look, the Jews expected the literal prophecies of the Old Testament to be fulfilled in a literal Messiah who came, in a sense, as a Messiah and rebuilt the temple. Jesus himself said, "The temple is my body," so you have, in Jesus' own words, allegorical or metaphorical interpretations of Old Testament passages. And what puzzles me about this is that there are some people who just take biblical passages literally and fling them. Those people are usually condemned as fundamentalists, but you're adopting the same approach. You're an educated man. You know, for example, that Christians don't just look at snippets of the Old Testament. In fact, the Old Testament is seen in Christianity as incorporated and in some profound way universalized and transformed in the New. So the tribal God of the Old Testament becomes a much more universal God, if you will, in the New Testament. He's no longer issuing his edicts just for his chosen people, the Jews, but you have a doctrine of universal brotherhood replacing, if you will, the more tribal conceptions in the Old Testament. Now, you mentioned this idea about religion and truth, and I agree completely, although I think that this very common explanation of religion as wish fulfillment or wishful thinking doesn't match what religion actually looks like. Imagine if all of us came into this room and we face all kinds of problems. This woman has diabetes. I need to have a hip replaced. So we say, let's make up a religion. I can see us coming up with the idea of heaven, because heaven is no suffering, no death that goes on forever. But I really don't think we'd come up with the idea of hell. Because if you think about it, hell is worse than diabetes. Hell is actually even worse than death. I don't think we'd come up with morality. Christian morality doesn't make our life easier. If someone proposed, let's have these 10 commandments, I would strike out 3 myself. Why? Because if we're trying to make life easy and wishful, why would we want thou shalt not do this and thou shalt not do that, and so on? Now, I think your strongest point was this idea that, hey, our religion is a function of where we're born. If you were born in Saudi Arabia, you'd be a Muslim, and so on. I think this is in philosophy called the genetic fallacy. The genetic fallacy is the fallacy of saying, because if you were born over there, you would think this, therefore that belief is wrong. For example, I could say, that if you were born, for example, in a remote village, you might never have heard of democracy. You might not know that E equals MC square. That may be true, but it has nothing to do with whether or not E equals MC square is true or not. Look, I think that if we look at Christianity, I'll just say a word about this. I think if we look at what religion does in the world, and is it true, you can look at it in some ways with secular eyes. Human beings are down here, but we have within us this idea of perfection, this idea of goodness. So we operate on the human level, but we can, in some senses, we long for this perfection that is, if you will, the divine level up here, perfection. And I see different religions as efforts to construct ladders from here, the human level, to the divine level. Judaism and Islam are ways of building ladders with codes and rules and diets and pray 5 times a day, go to Mecca, and so on. Well, the Christian idea is simply based on the very anthropological observation that, look, it's very unlikely that we human beings, flawed as we are, will be able to reach those heights. no matter how hard we try. If there is a bridging, if you will, between the level of man and the level of God, it's going to have to come not by human beings climbing higher, but by God reaching down. God has to, in some sense, condescend to the human level. That's the only way that this chasm can be closed. So, quite apart from biblical faith, what I'm saying is, does this make sense to you as a description for how religion could be true? In other words, if God is going to, if you reach down to man, He would have to do it in some way. The incarnation of Christ is, if you will, God's way of coming down to the human level. I want to make a final observation about all this, and that is, it's not just a matter of what is true. We've talked about that. We've gone back on the arguments back and forth. But in some ways, some of the questions we face, like, is there another life? We're never going to know the final answer to it. In some senses, the question for Peter Singer is, what kind of evidence would make you believe? We are in the position of a man who has dated a woman for 5 years and is now deciding whether to propose marriage. Now, in a sense, you could say, you know what, I'm waiting for the data. I want to know what life over the next 40 years is going to be like with this woman. You'll never know. If you say, I'm going to be an agnostic, I'm going to wait for the data to come in, she'll marry someone else or you will both be dead. We have to go with what we do know. So as fallible human beings making sense in the world, it seems to me that when we look at this universe out there, when we look at this morality in here, the best explanation for it is that we are created human beings, created by God, and if we believe that, what follows is a kinder, a gentler, a more humane universe. It doesn't only make sense, it also makes our lives better. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You've all been very patient, and we know that there's suffering in the world because you've suffered on those hard benches for a long time.